Hi, this is Kate Tickner from Pyramid Analytics, the decision intelligence company that helps clients make more intelligent decisions from their data. Today, it's my great pleasure to introduce Paul Foster and Lee Freeman of Auditel. Welcome, Paul and Lee.
Hi.
Hi, Kate.
Hi there. So Paul and Lee are experts in ESG and carbon reduction with around 25 years of combined experience. So today we're here to talk on the theme of increased top-line revenue, how carbon-based supply chain transformation can help your business grow faster, brackets, sell more stuff. With international treaties aiming to keep global warming to less than 1.5 degrees, everyone is trying to lower their carbon footprint. We've all seen the stories about the climate change, the extremes of temperature, and the impact and chaos that ensues. But there's still a lot of confusion about how individuals and companies can reduce their carbon emissions. Today, we're going to focus in on how to do this within the specific area of supply chain. So let's get started. So let's go to Lee first of all. Now, Lee, when we've talked about this in the past, you've shared that large companies have got lots of ideas about how to reduce carbon, but they really just don't know where to focus. They're being encouraged to look at direct and indirect emissions of their operations, as it seems to be the easiest opportunity, but you seem to think there's a better area for them to focus on. So could you please tell us a bit more about that?
Yes, thanks, Kate. I think one of the big areas to look at is the area of a company's supply chain. And I just want to relate a story that I was actually told by a colleague of mine regarding blueberries. So this has stuck in my mind, certainly over a number of years. Now, the person concerned, they'd undertaken a study on where most of the costs associated with transporting, growing blueberries, getting them to the market in Holland. And what they decided was that, or found, I guess, rather than decided, was that 80% of the cost of getting the blueberry from a farm in South America, say, to the market in Holland was associated with the packaging of that blueberry. So they came up with a revised packaging service made from recycled material. Now, what that did was three things. One, it reduced the wastage of the blueberries from in their transporting. It also meant that they could reduce the level of transport they needed and the number of journeys, because they were able to pack these crates slightly more tightly in the whatever mode of transport they were using. And thirdly, it meant that they made this new container out of recycled plastic, which meant, hence the name, you could reuse it. So not only were they reducing their costs from that, obviously that reduction in transport, reduction in material use had a huge impact on their carbon emissions. So every business has their blueberry, is what I'd like to say. And it could be packaging, it could be aluminium, it could be metal, but it's trying for a company to identify which of their areas is going to deliver their 80%, 70%, 60%. And some of that operational carbon is only going to be responsible for maybe 5 or 10% of a company's emissions. So trying to find that blueberry story in every company can really be the key.
Excellent. All right, well, let's talk a little bit more about that. And so, Paul, why don't you share with us how Auditel is working with clients to help them decarbonise their supply chains, and perhaps give us a few examples? On top of the blueberries, of course.
Yes, of course. I mean, quite rightly, you need to start somewhere. And governments and authorities around the world have got companies to focus on their operational carbon because it's an easier place to start. So people have focused on scope 1, 2, and 3 operational. But actually, in the early days, we discovered with one construction company in particular, that actually, I won't say the operational carbon was irrelevant, but the aluminium that they used in their facades represented 80% of their carbon. So I guess to sort of build on the blueberry story, aluminium was their blueberry, right? Okay. And every organization has got materials that are likely to make up the core of their carbon. But if you look for your aluminium or blueberry or whatever it is, and then start looking at the 80%, you now have an opportunity to focus on the fastest, cheapest way of decarbonising its supply chain. So think about 80% of all that organisation's carbon within that aluminium. So we then started alongside this. We were looking at how we could help them with their estimating, because increasingly people are saying, well, how much carbon is in that product or service that you're delivering into me? And typically organisations scratch their heads and say, well, I don't know. We'll see if we can sort of work it all out. And we were asked by this particular company to help them estimate that. So there's all sorts of ways of estimating it. But of course, you need to simplify the estimating process. So if you look at a construction company, let's try and simplify it. You look at materials, obviously, their aluminium. You look at their labour and their transport. And then the fourth element that you put in there is the carbon. So we started working on that. And then we realised that actually aluminium was such a big proportion. So we investigated the supply chain around aluminium. And we discovered that if you bought aluminium in one place rather than another, you could reduce the amount of embodied carbon by over half. Now here's this company.
Okay.
Here's this company that's putting proposals in front of people that's now going to have the embodied carbon in there. And of course, they've already jumped a step ahead, because clearly people are asking for embodied carbon. But if you can say, not only can we give you the embodied carbon numbers, but they're half what they should be because we're buying it through XYZ routes, and these are the reasons why. And you help them understand why it's lower carbon so that they can sell that to their clients. And that is that's 2 steps ahead.
That's brilliant, isn't it? 50% is a massive, massive difference.
Exactly. And so if you think back to the 80% of that organisation's carbon, you're making a huge impact if you're doing that. And that's probably a good way to describe it. I mean, there are plenty of other examples, but it's all around focusing on helping the client sell more stuff. And I guess what you're trying to do is to move from compliance, i.e. we need to do this, that, and the other to comply with various rules and regulations, to focusing on how we can sell more stuff. And actually, the way to sell more stuff is to reduce the embodied carbon. Amusingly, the guy, when I said, oh, the solution is to go here for your aluminium, he laughed and said, yeah, I know, but because it's low embodied carbon aluminium, they're going to charge me a load more. And I just laughed back and said, that's assuming they know it. And actually, that's the core. Most people don't even understand the carbon that they've got within their own products and services. Right. And nor did that aluminium supplier. And by the way, surprise, surprise, we're talking to a load of aluminium suppliers who are looking to export into the EU because there's taxes coming down the road. Anyway, that's another story for maybe later.
Okay. But I think the other aspect of what you've said is that it's about selling more stuff. It's about, halving, potentially even bigger cuts to your carbon, embodied carbon, but also about collecting more data. And so if we have a look at that, perhaps Lee, I think one of the challenges that we've talked about when we talk about collecting more data is that the sorts of companies that you and Paul are talking to on a daily basis are dealing with many, many disparate data sets across multiple different legacy systems. So how do they get around that problem in terms of being able to do that analysis to look at things like embodied carbon across all of that data?
Thanks, Kate. And I think, one of the things, and using the example that Paul used as well, lots of companies believe they have the data necessary to calculate their carbon to start with. And frankly, they don't. And, there's people get hung up on comparing data you need for financial purposes to data you need for carbon reporting. And let me just give you a simple example of an energy bill. Most financial systems will record the fact that you've spent £100, for example, on energy usage this month. But that tells you nothing about your carbon usage, because your carbon emissions are based on your usage of that energy. So if you just looked at the spend data, and with the unfortunate increase in energy prices over the last 18 months, by therefore spending more, people would assume that your emissions have gone up. In fact, the likelihood is, but because prices have gone up, usage has gone down. So it's really key in this to start with is looking at what data is needed for carbon accounting and what data is needed for financial accounting. And they're very much different. And on the example Paul used, I was having conversations with a financial controller, etc., and he was sending me lots and lots of data. And I was going back and said, that's great, thank you, but, and he was, well, whatever. So I think there's 2 things there. That first of all, it's identifying that initial data. But then you're absolutely right. It's about getting that data from lots of different systems. Energy is quite an easy one, potentially, as most energy providers now have their own portal on where you can actually go and download data. But, you know, imagine if you're a company that's got 1,000, 500, or even, you know, 100 sites, and you've got 100 different portals to log on to. That's going to be a full-time job almost for someone else. So
Yes.
I think that's where it's all about leaving the data where it is and then looking at platforms, and that's where obviously someone like Pyramid come in to actually being able to interrogate that data and pull the data in without actually moving it. Because it's all very well copying data, moving it to a new database, putting it in the cloud, but all you're doing is increasing potentially the inaccuracy within that data every time you move it, but also you're actually increasing your carbon footprint by moving that data.
Oh, the irony. Yes, of course,
So,
because it
you know,
has to be stored somewhere.
A cloud database has a carbon footprint, and, you know, and so if you've got it on your database and a copy in the cloud and a copy on someone's laptop, you're just increasing a carbon footprint by trying to probably improve a process, which I think therefore is, you know, where organizations like Pyramid and your solution can really help, because it's not about, my understanding anyway, of moving the data. It's more about the interrogation of the data where it currently sits.
I think that's a really good point. In fact, it came up in a conversation I had earlier that people often think about the financial impact of having to migrate data, and people talk about digital transformation and data migration projects, but they very rarely consider the ESG ramifications of replicating and copying and moving data around. And I think increasingly, now that we're having these sorts of conversations, that they're going to have to. And you know, that's all good in terms of, as you say, being able to leave, if you can find a solution that will help you leave things where they are and still get the results you need. So Paul, when you first started, when you talked about this idea of offering a carbon neutral service, and that can you walk us through some of the benefits of, let's say, you know, you're an aluminium supplier, what's the benefits to you of offering a carbon neutral service in order to help your clients reduce the burden of their carbon reporting? And how's it going to help you do better business?
Aluminium is quite simple because it's a product. Okay, so let's complicate it a little bit more to make it a little bit more exciting. Okay,
keep us all awake. Yeah, great.
The issue is that if Scope 3 supply chain represents, depending on the company, anywhere between 70, 80, 90% of your carbon, and that's an area that people are not, well, for two reasons. One, it's too big and they can't get their heads around it, and two, many of them are still focused on the operational carbon, so they haven't even thought about it. But if you're going to sell more stuff or increase the profitability of the stuff, in other words, you're going to differentiate your product or service in the market, then, you know, you've got to address this. So what are the real benefits? Well, go back to the data story. My goodness, your supply chain is just a huge amount of data. Now, if we talk about the Europeans and what they're doing around carbon border adjustment mechanisms, or CBAM for short, which will increase taxation around people exporting into the EU, what we're actually saying is that people are going to need to treat carbon accounting, I'll refer to it as carbon accounting, to see where I'm going with this, as really important in terms of accuracy of data. Okay, so this is sort of a little way down the road, but actually not that far. So if you look at CBAM, the taxes don't come until 2026, but it's based on 2025 data, which means that you need to start looking at it now, which is, well, actually, do you know what? On the operational carbon, people in some cases are struggling to get all of that data within 12 months. Now, by the time you increase the complexity of the data you need for a supply chain, good luck if you're trying to do it in 18 months, okay? Now, we're talking about, so why would you want to do it? Well, of course, there's the differentiation. If you've got a lower carbon product, then that's a good thing, because, by the way, if I'm an organization, I'm going to buy well, when I've got my head around it, I'm going to buy a lower carbon product. Why? Because I don't need to offset it cost or reduce it somewhere else cost. And so actually the price on that proposal, as well as the carbon, are as critical. So in other words, that carbon has a cost associated. So I might buy one price, actually it might be slightly higher, but there's a lower carbon content. So why is that really important? Well, Now let's make it a little bit more complex. Instead of it being aluminium, let's make it a managed service or something where there's complexity to it. And so there's lots of areas that you're being invoiced for. It could be maintenance, it could be new product coming in or replacing bits and pieces within that managed service. I mean, I'm not going to bore you with the complexity because I'm sure people can use their own imagination, but then you've got lots of invoices, lots of data, lots of carbon, and tracking all of that is an absolute nightmare. And when you consider what organisations outsource these days, quite a lot of things, your managed service being outsourced can be a huge headache. It's almost like outsourcing a part of your company. Well, it is. And so trying to track that is a nightmare. So imagine now that I'm going to sell you a carbon neutral service. What is carbon neutrality? Well, carbon neutrality means I don't have to report anything on it because there is nothing to report. I'm actually delivering I'm not going to use the word net zero because it's misleading. It's a net zero solution to you. And essentially what offsetting is reducing the carbon within that product or service as much as you can and offsetting the balance. Now, there is no net zero at the moment. That's what we're going to look forward to in 2050, 60, or if you're Chinese, 70. It's a long way down the road. So actually carbon neutrality is a really positive step and a statement to move in the right direction. And that product, if you were to do it in most markets in the world now, I'm talking about putting the boundary around a product or service rather than an organization, then you will be launching a first in your sector. So why would you want to do that? Well, there's so many reasons. I mean, the cost, the carbon, there's just, I could write you a long list. So It's really important. And by the way, you've now got a premium service.
Yeah.
And that's going to take a big, well, it depends on what the managed service is, but that's going to take a chunk of carbon out of your supply chain as well.
I mean, just to give you an example, Kate, on that, with one of the things Paul and I were talking about earlier about aluminium, that lower embodied carbon product was a premium of about 50% to a normal aluminium product that this company was using. So straight away, that supplier of that aluminium is being able to charge 50% extra because it has a lower embodied carbon. Now, I'm sure if you said to everyone on this webinar today, you can raise your prices by 50%, I'm sure, we can't do a straw poll, but I reckon 99.9% would probably jump at the chance, and so it may not be selling more stuff in terms of quantity, as Paul was saying, but actually being able to charge that premium because you've got an environmentally friendly product. And I think that's one of the key things to really consider, because people will buy that and pay that premium because of all the reasons that Paul mentioned as well.
And I think what's important is that what you're saying is this is a relatively new thing. People aren't doing it yet. So the earlier you adopt that rationale, the more differentiated you'll become in the marketplace, potentially steal market share. So you become differentiated because you're saving your clients time and money from having to do carbon reporting. But even though you're saving them money on that side, you can then take some of that back by charging a premium for your product or service. It's great. Okay. So overall then, what do you see as clearly we're here to talk a little bit, you've mentioned Pyramid. What do you see as the benefits of something like Pyramid in terms of decision intelligence software in relation to carbon reporting, combined with expert services that you offer to your end clients? Can you give us some examples? Perhaps, Paul, you want to start perhaps with that one?
I mean, to kick off on that, go through the managed service and the complexity of that, and especially if it's multi-country as well. You're looking at lots and lots of data from different areas of that business. So in the early days, it's a bit of a nightmare for us to actually locate all the data sources. Okay, so go back to the example of the electricity bill that's not got any kilowatt hour usage on it. You've got a similar situation there where there's lots of data that not necessarily is the right data. So you've got to make certain assumptions. And I'm going to say one of the ones that I love saying and always puts a smile on Lee's face is never let perfection get in the way of progress. You've got to start somewhere. Start at the beginning. And the beginning is not perfect. But if you start with something, proxy data, be transparent, make sure you explain to people what you're doing. The fact that you're not actually doing something that's 100% doesn't matter. As long as you're being transparent, you need to start somewhere. And as time goes on, we talk about data improvement and continual improvement and so on and so forth. And that's all accepted within the standards. And we've not really mentioned the standards here, so I'll just throw that in. When we started our journey in doing carbon accounting and verification and reduction, we aligned ourselves with the BSI standards. So everything that we're doing is internationally recognized standards, as in ISO standards and PAS, where they're being formulated at the moment. So everything that we're doing refers back to a standard, and they accept that you can't start with something being 100% perfect. But what they are doing is challenging you every year when you go back and you say, well, I can't do this perfect this time, but this is what we've used, and at least it gets us going. Next year, they'll be looking for what you promised. In other words, I'm going to get it more accurate because I'm going to do X, Y, Z, and they'll be so you've got someone checking on you on an annual basis to make sure that you're following that ISO standard, that PAS standard, whatever it is that you're measuring. I think that's probably a good place to sort of get some feedback from you, Lee, in terms of what are your thoughts?
Yeah, and I think one of the key things on this is, we've spent the last 20 or so minutes talking purely about carbon. Now, carbon's only one small element of the whole ESG agenda. There's lots of disclosure schemes out there at the moment where people are really looking at the integrity of your data. And we've probably all seen the news recently about some of the protests going on at the Shell AGM, where they had a carbon footprint, they had a carbon reduction plan, but activists were saying, well, you're not doing things quick enough. And I think gradually, it's about looking at the governance of that data. Is it trustworthy? Is it credible? And using one of Paul's points, is there transparency in what you're doing? Because everyone does accept in this, no data set is ever 100%. But that whole governance piece around that data, auditing this data is coming down the line. Paul mentioned the EU regulations and CBAM. That's going to affect your tax bill. So you've definitely got to get the data right and the governance of that. But,
can I throw in, would you run a company without recording your sales, your costs and your profits? Of course not. And the directors would all be out on their ear if they tried to do that. So clearly, as this becomes taxable, not only do you need to make sure it's as accurate as you can get it, because heads will roll if you don't, but it's going to be verified by a third party. So, the EU are not happy to, go with what people say. They're going to get audited in the same way as they do their financial accounts.
Yeah, so, and I think when we talked about this in the past, we talked about the fact that, many people do a lot of this using multiple spreadsheets and perhaps bits of string. And to your point, Lee, you said, well, that's fine. But then when it comes to governance, how can you then show that you're confident in the accuracy of the results? But equally, you have to empower people to do self-service. So you've got to have that idea of governed self-service, keeping costs down, but then also have this trust in all the data that you're collecting. And so to do that, spreadsheets really aren't going to fit as well as perhaps something like a decision intelligence platform such as we've discussed with Pyramid. So it's all about having auditable data.
The other thing to throw in on that is the fact that once we found all that data, and as we're improving it, the next question the client will ask us is, how the hell are you going to automate this collection? Because I haven't got the time to keep using this, that, and the other, and spreadsheets. And to be quite honest, nor have we once we've found the data. So I guess the next part of that process is then to automate the collection of. And invariably, most organisations have got data in silos all over the place. So you can imagine what this will be like as well.
Exactly.
And that comes down, Kate, doesn't it, just at the end there, to your self-service point, doesn't it, about, at the moment, there's new accounting standards coming out on this as well. And at the moment, the audit firms are being asked to provide limited assurance. So it's almost, that feels right sort of approach. But that's going to change. It's going to become same as an audit report, where it's going to be some form of reasonable assurance. And then that whole data integrity and data governance just goes to a new level. And I think having the multiple spreadsheets that, I as an accountant have used over many years and had sleepless nights when I can't work out why it's giving me a different answer than it did 5 minutes ago is going to be key. And that's where, using some form of intelligent data software is actually going to be the way forward. And because that ultimately is going to save time and cost as well.
That's right. So the Auditel,
which is why we're talking to you, Kate.
Excellent. Well, so let's recap. So, because you've neatly gone right back to the collection of data. We've talked about blueberries, aluminium quite a bit. We've talked about data collection and analytics, all in relation to this idea of embodied carbon, how there's a bigger opportunity out there in terms of looking at the embodied carbon in your supply chain versus always just looking at operational carbon, to the extent of that being, say, 5%, but you think that embodied carbon in supply chain could be up to 80%, which is fantastic. So it's a really big opportunity for people to change. You're not expecting that they will get it all right straight away, but it's an iterative process, and they've got to get started somewhere. And then some of the advantages of having carbon neutral services are things like being able to offer a premium service, become differentiated, and saving your clients time and money, so therefore giving them a better service. And then overall thinking about this holistically, because ultimately all of this yet again rolls up into the office of the CFO, doesn't it? I mean, you've talked about being an accountant, Lee. Suddenly they've got supply chain, they've got ESG, they've got everything else, procurement rolling up into them, and this is just yet another headache that if they think about it holistically across the systems and create something and solutions that will help them with governance and analytics across the board, then that will also save them time and money. And then just to wrap up in terms of that idea of not moving data around, bring that into the mix as well. So if you're thinking about ESG, you can't be thinking, oh, I'm going to move the data, I'm going to copy the data, because that will ironically increase your carbon footprint. So we've done a lightning wrap up there, and from a really interesting session.
Can I just throw in a few more things as a summary?
Of course, yeah.
Just to summarise, everyone looks at it as compliance. Okay.
Yeah.
We've talked about increasing sales and selling more stuff. How about reducing costs? So costs and carbon go hand in hand. It's obvious with energy, not so obvious with other areas. I mean, so there's a cost reduction opportunity. There's increasing sales or margins opportunity. And then last but not least, just a quick story where I was talking to somebody the other day, and they're bringing in a revolutionary new product into the UK construction industry. And when I got hold of this chief exec, I said, what are you doing about carbon? Carbon? Well, it's sort of on my list, but a low way down, because I've got all of these other problems to deal with first. I said, what are the other problems? And to cut a very long story short, it was really about him differentiating the product that he had in the market. It had a lot of plus points. However, if you try changing specifications in an established industry, it takes you a long time. So I said, well, let me turn the whole thing on its head. Why don't you look at it from a carbon perspective? Because you're telling me this is manufactured in Germany, Switzerland, and Iceland. Now, I know that they're all countries that are very good on renewable energy. The fact that they're manufacturing something there will have a good carbon story. So guess what? He wants to talk to me about that. And that's really about using carbon to tick boxes to win contracts. That's all it was about.
That's a fantastic segue into the last thing I wanted to say, Paul. Thank you. So what I was going to say was, if you would like to get started, having watched this webinar with a free carbon hotspot report for your business, please do get in touch with either Paul Foster or Lee Freeman to discuss in more detail. And remember that up to 80% of your carbon is coming from something you and your business might not even be looking at. So thank you very much for your time today.
Thank you, Kate.